Hello, Internet! Welcome to more of this idiot. Since 2014, spending 5 to 7 nights at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria has been a common pastime for modern fans of spooky games. But let's be fair, nowadays FNAF has become more well known for its lore, or more specifically how its lore is too confusing for any normal, sane person to understand. But I feel like it shouldn't be that complicated anymore. And so I wanted to investigate its complicatedicity to see if people getting into FNAF now really have to feel so intimidated, starting with why it got this reputation in the first place. Okay, first, obviously, FNAF's lore isn't simple by any means. I think most people who have grown up on the series have kind of come to the conclusion that FNAF's story was entirely made up as each game came out. 3 games almost back to back each tried to wrap up the story in a big, sensible finale, with each ending basically invalidating the last. Every game was determined to jump back and forth along the timeline of events so that we never got information in order, and sometimes it felt like there were random twists that were just made to be confusing on purpose. For example, story-wise, FNAF 2 just seemed like a sequel to FNAF 1 in every way. The animatronics from 1 are back, but in disrepair in the backrooms, having been replaced by these brand new animatronics we've never seen before. The phone calls constantly talk about how the old location had to close down due to likely murder-related reasons. But then, right at the end, the game says, oh wait, no, this is actually a prequel to FNAF 1. Now, I'll clarify, this was fine at the time and it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, the first thing people noticed about the FNAF 2 phone calls was,
why do you sound like that guy that probably died in the last one?
But the problem comes in later when the story became more fleshed out. Now the timeline of events has a nearly identical location to the FNAF 1 pizzeria that was shut down, FNAF 2 happened and that shut down, and then FNAF 1 happened again. Although another twist that was unnecessarily confusing even when it first happened was FNAF 4's bite. In the early years of FNAF, the only important event anyone talked about was
the bite of 87.
The bite?
Yeah.
So when FNAF 4 showed us a bite on screen, it makes sense that people would assume,
was that the bite of 87?
No.
But unlike FNAF 2 being a prequel, this one almost feels like an afterthought, because leading up to FNAF 4's release, all of the promotional material practically spelled out that it was going to be the bite of 87 specifically, until a random TV in-game said 1983. Now, even without the TV, this couldn't actually be the bite of 87, because the only direct consequence of the bite we know about is that the Freddy animatronics aren't allowed to walk around during the day anymore. So you'd think the animatronics being able to walk around was the cause of the bite, which isn't the case here. But making this a random separate bite that happened in 1983 also means that the bite of 87 is not only no longer the only public example of the animatronics causing trouble, but it's also not even close to being the most important one. And when you completely undermine the most notorious event in your entire franchise by arbitrarily introducing a new, very similar event and tricking people into thinking it's the same thing, then yeah, that's gonna be confusing. Then there was Sister Location introducing a purple person who is deliberately different from the actual purple guy that exists in the rest of the series, who himself randomly turns orange in the next game, and Pizzeria Simulator had characters go through major changes entirely without explanation anywhere except in the source code of 2 websites. Point is, yes, there's a reason the series' story felt complicated back in the day, but that doesn't mean it still has to be that way.
What?
At this point, so many mysteries have been deciphered and so many details have been determined unimportant, so why do newcomers to the series face the same confusing complications that people did when the games were first coming out? Mandatory disclaimer, I'm a perfectly normal, rational I'm normal when it comes to having opinions about things, and that means that despite my opinions, I harbor no dislike towards theorists or people who watch them, because I am both of those things. Having said that, Game theory is a terrible way to learn FNAF lore, and treating game theory as the only source of FNAF lore is not only wrong, but also makes it harder for new people to get into FNAF because theories aren't lore. For one, 90% of FNAF game theory videos are outdated or contradicted by later theories, and the more recent ones have to build off of so little info that there's really no way to say that they're correct, or they're purely trying to predict the future of the series, which obviously isn't relevant to somebody trying to learn the current story. So really, there's no time on this timeline of timeline constructions that would be helpful to new timers. The issue is that most modern FNAF fans, myself included, were raised on these theories, and instead of trying to teach new people the basic story, we try to teach them how to theorize about the story, because that's what we learned to do. We subject them to the same journey we went through over 10 years in the span of a day, like a hyperbolic time chamber of bears and purple people. Then at the other end, we expect them to be able to separate useful based info from outdated cringe info. Now, to be fair, you could go through and pick out specific theory videos that won't have any contradictions or outdated information in them if you happen to be struggling with a script and your brain is looking for every excuse it can to be distracted, not speaking from experience, but they'll still have details that are unnecessary and confusing to someone who just wants to know why this purple guy is important to the robot bear game. Like, most modern FNAF theories mention the books in some way. And yeah, you need the books in order to theorize about the deeper lore or predict where the games are going, but gamers hate books. And if something isn't in the games yet, it just simply isn't needed to understand the basic idea of the story. But there's another big issue with this idea that FNAF theories are the bastion for factual lore. It makes it harder for theorists to actually theorize without being criticized for their theories being quote-unquote inaccurate. Because people feel like the only way to learn the lore is through theories, there's been this increasing perception that theories need to be 100% correct, 100% believable, and 100% based on fact. But that's like 300%. That doesn't make sense mathematically. Game theory especially gets absolutely lampooned by fans of any series, even outside of the FNAF sphere, if a theory is wrong or too unreasonable, because everybody either thinks that incorrect theories are purposeful misinformation, or they think that everybody who watches theories is stupid and will fully believe it as fact without a second thought. Now, in fairness, there are people who just watch theories and believe them as fact. I mean, that's what I was just talking about with all this FNAF theories are lore nonsense, but that's not the fault of the theories, that's the fault of the people blindly believing them. And unfortunately, fighting that is a losing battle. If somebody believes something without a second thought, you will not be the one to give them a second thought to have. Either that or they simply don't care if it's real or not. And look, yes, generally the goal of a theory is to be correct. They don't make them trying to make them wrong. But MatPat wasn't writing the story of FNAF, he was forming connections with the details that were already written. Often when people tell newcomers to watch all of the game theory FNAF videos, they'll say to skip the first one. It's about how the first game was based on a real-life series of murders at a Chuck E. Cheese, and it's a really good theory. Yet it's one of the few people will say to skip because it isn't about the lore. But here's the thing. Theories obviously shouldn't be the foundation of knowledge for an entire franchise. I think everybody agrees on that. But that's an issue with FNAF, right? Its lore is so obtuse that you're forced to use theories as a basis for knowledge. But MatPat didn't just have a lovely chat with Freddy Fazbear to learn the story, he went through the games just like we did. So why does it feel like we need to immediately jump to game theory to solve everything for us? So far, the main idea I've been noticing with how FNAF's plot ends up feeling so complex is how it's presented to people. Of course, it felt complicated to fans of the games when it was coming out because the story was being built completely out of order. And of course, people feel like they have to immediately go to theories to understand the story when everyone says that it's such a complicated plot, you have no hope of understanding it otherwise. But there's actually some smaller issues with presentation I've noticed as well. And unfortunately, this is gonna be another section where the issue I'm looking at is largely caused by what is essentially my target audience for this video, so sorry. But in this case, you could argue that FNAF itself is to blame as well. For what, you say, urging me to stop thinking of a clever transition and just start listing things? Well, one that I think a lot of people underestimate is how fans perceive/treat the redesigns of certain characters throughout the series. Are you really telling me that in-universe, Fazbear Entertainment had these old, worn-down animatronics in FNAF 2 that they wanted to fix up to be the main mascots again for FNAF 1? And instead of just cleaning and fixing what they had, they took it and went sending them all through reverse puberty? No, they didn't do that. That was just a redesign between games unrelated to the lore, most likely done to make Freddy and Toy Freddy a bit more different from each other. Even in FNAF 2 itself, Withered Freddy is just simply called Freddy. Fans were the ones who assigned the new name, but that only becomes a serious issue when FNAF embraced this. Merchandise and future games all treat these two Fazbears as entirely separate entities when they're actually just the same animatronic, at most 2 years apart from each other. Sure, the name Withered Freddy is just like saying it's good old Freddy, but he's withered now, and that works great for describing that these are the same animatronic at slightly different times. However, Toy Freddy is an entirely separate animatronic using the same adjective plus Freddy name structure. Phantom Freddy is the same as the first Fred, Nightmare Freddy isn't, and Ruin Freddy is the same as Glamrock Freddy but not Normal Freddy. See how this can be confusing? Every single iteration of this character changes the design and name, yet sometimes it's the same animatronic. The big problem is that this confusion is in FNAF's interest. So much so that FNAF fan games in the official fanverse thing need their designs to differ enough to make merchandise from. Now, in the case of boring old Fazfred, this isn't really a problem for understanding the story. However, Springtrap is William Afton, and Scraptrap is also William Afton, but Plushtrap is not William Afton, and both Glitchtrap and Burntrap are actually just the mimic, but to be fair, we really had no way to know that at the time. Unlike Freddy, every appearance of William Afton is the same guy who just can't take a hint to get out of here. So differentiating random rabbits from the main killer in the game is pretty important. But these names and design changes have even led to serious discussion on why William would have changed his appearance between FNAF 3 and 6. The simple answer is that he didn't. It took Freddy Fazbear one game to get a major redesign. Of course Springtrap's gonna look different after a gap of 3. And another notable example is that Golden Freddy is just a recolored version of whatever the current Freddy model is in that game. But that doesn't mean he is just a yellow Freddy. Golden Freddy is Fredbear. He's not a Freddy at all. Again, to be fair, how were fans supposed to know that this yellow coloration of Freddy was A, not a Freddy, and B, actually named Fredbear, when neither of those details were even true until FNAF 4? But the funny thing is, Golden Freddy is the only animatronic in the entire series to keep the same name throughout multiple games. And that name isn't even the real name of the animatronic. I feel like that's an issue. Moving on from redesign madness, I also want to talk about pretty much the only significant detail somebody new to FNAF is likely to know already.
Was that the—
I'll try to stop bringing up the bite so often, but if we're talking about confusing presentation, introducing somebody to the story of FNAF by saying, hey, you know that one thing you know about FNAF from the memes?
The bite of 87? It's turned upside down.
Yeah, that's wrong. It's actually the bite of 83. Isn't a great starting point for people. I think generally the distinction between 83 and 87 won't matter because specific dates like that aren't super important unless you're trying to create a FNAF timeline, which I don't anticipate most people will do. Speaking of timelines though, there's also the issue that FNAF's story is 2 stories at this point. The first 6 games were one contained story, and as much as modern FNAF titles tend to rely a bit too heavily on callbacks, Help Wanted and Beyond is an entirely new, separate story. Realistically, you don't even need to know anything about the first 6 games to follow this new plotline, and I think making that more clear would really help new fans understand what's going on. But by this point, if you've made it this far, you may be thinking, well now, Mr. Smartsicle, since you seem to know exactly why FNAF's lore seems so complex, why don't you explain the FNAF story without it being complicated? And well, I'm not smart, but I do want to try that whole summary thing, since I think we've identified the key factors causing this lore to be so complex. So let me put my Freddies where my bears are and give a hopefully simple explanation of The first 6 FNAF games are one story, the Ghost story. It's a series about William Afton, the owner of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and a killer whose victims' ghosts possess various animatronics he's made throughout the years of the Freddy Fazbear franchise. Eventually, William's crimes catch up to him, and he is shadow-realmed. The modern FNAF games are part of a new ongoing story, the AI story. It's about a self-learning AI program called the Mimic that has learned one thing: violence, and it's now growing to infect tons of programs surrounding the modern Fazbear enterprise. Now, those are incredibly simple summaries, and obviously not really what people think of as a good summary of the FNAF games. But do you need that basic foundation before you can start diving into any story of a decent size? I'm not gonna start summarizing the plot of Mario by just explaining every detail in chronological order. You need to know that Bowser kidnapped Princess Peach first, before you start to wonder what me explaining Peach's childhood of go-kart racing has to do with Mario stomping Koopas. But with the basis established, let's do a bit more of a detailed summary. In the first 2 games, we play as a night guard working in a Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, and we get to experience the animatronics being super aggressive due to all that being haunted by dead spirit stuff. In FNAF 3 and 4, we learn about William Afton. We see that one of his sons got free admission to that bite thing that everyone is raving about, leading to his early death. This is what caused William Afton to start acting a little quirky, just like the animatronics at night. Am I right, FNAF fans? Woo! Many years after his murders have settled down, the spirits of the kids he killed essentially corner Afton. He puts on a suit that is quite dangerous, and he experiences said danger, but he stays alive in a way, haunting himself, much like how the kids haunted the animatronics. In FNAF 5, sister location, we're more properly introduced to William's other son, Michael, who feels like finding his father to punish him for his wacky antics. Finally, in Pizzeria Simulator, we meet Henry Emily, the business partner of William Afton, who works with Michael to right what William has done wrong. They gather all the haunted animatronics, including William himself, and Henry lights it on fire to send the past off in a final blaze of pain. As for a more detailed summary of the AI story of the modern FNAF games, well, it's still a work in progress, so I'd say the only thing we know for certain is important is that there's now in-game equivalents of the Ghost Story era of FNAF games within the universe of FNAF. And the modern Fazbear Entertainment Company basically embraces these games as convenient ways to cover up their past crimes by pretending they were all just funny, scary bear stories from this fictional game series. Which means there might be some truth that's being masked here, likely those wacky murders some guy did, but all that ghost stuff probably didn't happen in this new AI continuity. In actuality, the main thing being covered up here is the Mimic, a mimicking program who has learned from Fazbear's long history of happy accidents. Hence why the Mimic tends to lean a bit more towards the murder scale than you'd usually like your AIs to do. Now, you FNAF heads out there might have noticed a quirky little technique I employed in these summaries, known as ignoring most of it, which was intentional. But before I dive into why I'm acting like ignoring all the complicated parts of FNAF to make it seem more simple makes me a genius, let's take a look at the final verdict. The results are in. Having thought about it way too much, I've determined that FNAF's lore is... okay, yeah, it's complicated, almost intentionally so, but that doesn't mean we have to present it that way. Like I mentioned, my summaries of FNAF left out a lot, and I'm not gonna pretend that there's any way to explain everything in FNAF in a logical, simple, easily digestible way, but that's okay. That's true with almost any story. FNAF's lore is a complicated mess with tons of loose threads and unnecessary details, but the way we present it as fans often makes those issues seem much worse than they actually are. It's obviously insanely complex for theorists to try to solve the lore, but it can genuinely be presented in a very straightforward way to people just trying to casually understand the story. Which, pretty satisfying answer to me. I don't know about you. What? You hated it? You're gonna sue me for wasting your time? Oh, you fool! While you were so concerned about my opinions on FNAF lore, I've been studying, learning the techniques that make Fazbear Entertainment immune to bankruptcy and lawsuits. You'll never catch me alive!